Welcome to this second session of the biannual MacroDev webinar that we have. The second session is every year, so we have a seminar every year. So this session we talk about like the Ukrainian and Russian conflict and the impact it's going to have, and it's actually having on commodity prices, on geopolitical tension, on balance of payment issues, fiscal issues, and also on the low carbon transition that countries were already starting to make. So today we are really lucky to have 5 people with us. We were supposed to have an external guest, an external panelist. Unfortunately, couldn't make it. We are still having the session in English, but in the chat, feel free to ask the question in English or in French, and I'm going to try to do my best to translate everything. So we have today with us Thomas Melonio, Executive Director, Innovation, Research and Strategy. And we also have Maxime Thérieux, economist at the AFD, who will do the first session. And we then have Sylvain Belfontaine, Alex Vigato, and Mylan Nogoff, who will do the third session. Thomas will start with a short introduction of the MacroDev and the publication, and then Maxime will do a first, the first official session, talking about the impact of the conflict and the impact on commodity prices and on various senses that the conflict is creating after like the COVID-19 impact and like everything that is going on basically in the world, more or less. And then Sylvain, Alex, and Mylan will present some country cases that you can also find in the publication. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to Thomas.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. So, bonjour à toutes et à tous, bienvenue à l'AFD. Nous allons parler de macroéconomie aujourd'hui. Je vais repasser à l'anglais dans quelques secondes, mais je voulais saluer nos collègues amis francophones qui nous suivent à distance. So, thank you so much, Emmanuel, for accepting to chair this session. We are happy today to gather our lead macroeconomist of EFD's research department. We were hoping to connect a colleague in Africa, but unfortunately this proved impossible in the last days. But still, we are quite happy to be able to cover the main macroeconomic topics of the day for developing countries. Well, as you know, inflation is back. You can see it through food or energy prices. Related, of course, to the invasion of Ukraine, but not only. We had observed already before that some inflation tensions are appearing in developing countries. We know that apart from food and energy prices, core inflation is also on the rise, not everywhere in the same manner. So we're going to discuss country by country, region by region, how the current situation is evolving on the front of prices. On the financial part, we also see interest rates rising. That's true, as you know, in Europe, in the US, but it's also very true in developing countries, and probably even more so than in Europe or in the US markets. Typically, countries increasing their interest rates to fight either a decrease in their domestic currency or to limit inflation, as I was saying earlier. But this conundrum between inflation and interest rates certainly changes the picture. And as you know, AFD is publishing every 6 months MacroDev, which is a general, which draws the general landscape of the economic situation in developing countries. That's in the introduction and first part. Then there's a number of chapters describing with particular details the situation in a list of developing countries. So and every other time we have a public presentation just like the one we have, and we're happy that you were able to join. Donc je vais le dire rapidement en français, tous les 6 mois, vous pouvez retrouver dans les collections de l'AFD et sur le site internet cette publication MacroDev qui donne un panorama général de la situation dans les pays en développement avec des focales qui sont mises sur une liste de pays. So today we're going to discuss the impact of currency variations, interest rates, inflation on a number of developing countries. Of course, among developing banks, we have the concern that debt sustainability may be at risk due not only to the accumulation of debt during the COVID period and after that, even before, to be honest, but also the impact of interest rates rising. For just to remind you or to introduce the debate that's going to start, we know that for the first time, the Human Development Index, the HDI, has decreased last year. So it's a major concern. Today, we're going to discuss macroeconomics, finance, currency, interest rates, inflation, but we certainly do not forget the social impacts that we're currently observing. I see already a few comments in French. So again, if you're not that familiar with English, n'hésitez pas à mettre vos commentaires dans le chat également en français. Nous allons essayer de gérer cette dualité des langues. Voilà, merci beaucoup à toutes et à tous. Je vous laisse avec mes collègues macroéconomistes éminents. Thanks again to everyone. I will leave you with our lead macroeconomist colleagues, and we're very happy again that you were able to join today. Merci.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Just a technical aspect, as Thomas said, feel free to use the tab, the question tab to ask your question. Ideally, more than the chat tab. We're going to try to look at the chat as well, but ideally, if you can use the question tab, that will be the best. So I will first leave the floor to Maxime, who will, Maxime Derrieux, so economist at AFD, well, senior economist at AFD. And he will talk about, as Thomas said, like the thematic session of this MacroDev. So, Maxime, to you.
Thank you, Manuel. So the thematic section for this MacroDev is called Developing Countries and the Low Carbon Transition, put to the test by the commodity shock. We are going to try and answer several questions in this presentation. That is actually an introduction or a summary of what you can find in the MacroDev. So in the next slide, we have the key questions I would like to address today. First one is, what is the extent of the boom in commodity prices? I'm going to give you short answers. So if you cannot attend the entire presentation, then we'll give you a basic snapshot of the answers. So what is the extent of the boom in commodity prices? Well, it's quite high. But it's something that has been put to the fore. Previous slide. Put to the fore by the conflict in Ukraine, but it was something happening before that, since mid-2020. So we're going to talk about this. How can we explain the current boom? It's basically supply and demand issues, and we're going to delve into that. Is this situation unprecedented in recent history? The short answer is no. What are the macroeconomic consequences on developing countries? What are the losers and the winners? We're going to talk about that. And can the current situation accelerate the energy transition? And we'll see there's a bit of a conundrum. So first, next slide, we're going to talk. We're going to try and answer the first three questions. What we've witnessed since mid-2020 is a general rise in commodities. That is affecting all commodities, energy, metals, food, and fertilizer. And it's something, again, that has been really talked about a lot in the media since the beginning of the year, especially since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But actually, it was something happening since mid-2020. For instance, between July 2020 and December 2021, the energy index by the World Bank increased by over 130%, which means more than doubling, and then increased again by 43% since the beginning of the year. Same thing for food. The increase between in the 18 months between mid-2020 and the end of 2021 was about 45%, and then there was an additional 25% increase since the beginning of the year, with wheat prices that we've heard a lot in the media doubling. So all in all, over the last 2 years, we've seen the price of oil quadrupling, the price of coal multiplied by 7, European gas by a whopping 19 times, and some of the energy metals such as lithium, cobalt, nickel, called the transition metals, also doubled. So these are the facts that we see, and they are represented on the graph on the upper right corner, where you can see really high levels that are quite striking. Now, how do we explain this increase? Well, it's basically, as I said earlier, about supply and demand. On the demand side, as we all know, after the initial collapse in prices during COVID, the outbreak of COVID in the spring of 2020, and several lockdowns worldwide. Some of those lockdowns were lifted, and demand started to resume quite strongly as soon as July 2020, more towards the end of 2020, early 2021. But that's been quite striking. So we had a global recession over 3% in 2020 and a rebound of over 6%. So this demand, this rebound was obviously driven by demand, which includes demand for energy, metals, food, etc. And this has been driving up prices. Climate change also had an impact because we've seen extreme weather and people needed to increase heating and cooling. That also affected energy prices. But it's also mostly a supply shock that is again driven by COVID-19. We know that COVID-19 has several implications in terms of supply chain disruptions, which are still happening today, and they are affecting supply with several bottlenecks observed across the globe. Climate change again has had a big impact. We've seen droughts or floods, for instance, floods in coal mines in Australia that have affected production. We've seen droughts in Latin America with the El Nino phenomenon, affecting harvests, for instance, for soy in Brazil. These are key factors that are independent of what's happening in Ukraine, and obviously the Ukraine war has exacerbated that trend. And now the third question is this something new? Is this unprecedented? When we look at nominal prices, yeah, it's quite striking. We see that European gas, coal, copper, wheat, corn, soy prices have reached historical levels. But I think we need to take a step back and look at real prices. That's what you see on the graph in the lower right corner. And when you look at real prices, actually the only real prices that have hit peaks are coal and European gas. But it's definitely not the case yet for oil, which has not reached its 2008 peak. Same thing for fertilizer, same thing for food. When you see food prices in real terms were much higher in the early 70s. You had food prices in 72 before the oil energy crisis. Same thing for aluminum, where you had a real peak in 1988 due to specific factors related to this metal. So it is striking in nominal terms. It is not as striking if you take a step back and deflate that and put prices in real terms. So I think that's the third key message. It's not something unprecedented. What is maybe more striking is that it's probably the first time that all commodities are impacted that heavily at the same time. So that's the simultaneous fact element, which is really striking. And again, what's also interesting, where the comparison is interesting, is that you have a geopolitical element having an additional impact to the group. But that's pretty much where the comparison stops. So that's a first snapshot and an answer to some of the key questions that we had. Now, looking at the impact on emerging and developing countries, we know, but I think it's important to stress it again, that the impact is mostly in terms of trade impacts and an inflationary shock. There will be some impacts in terms of public finance that we're going to talk about in terms of growth, but the key messages are it's in terms of trade shock with different effects on our EDC, so emerging and developing countries, and it's an inflationary shock. In terms of balance of payments, in terms of trade, the quite obvious answer, which is shown in this graph, is that there will be some big winners and big losers, but only a few big winners. And the big winners are, unsurprisingly, the the hydrocarbon exporters. So you have on the upper right corner of this chart, you see that countries like Azerbaijan, Congo, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, etc. So hydrocarbon fossil fuel exporters that will benefit, that will see a major increase in their current account balance. This graph shows on the x-axis the delta of the current accounts prediction, so the forecast that the IMF was giving at the end of 2021 versus the one, the revision in April 2022. And you can see there's a big leap for countries just like Congo, which is going to gain 20 percentage point in terms of current account, Azerbaijan over 30%. So those countries will have current account surpluses in the range of 25-35% of GDP, which is quite huge. And on the other hand, losers will be the small state islands that are heavily dependent on tourism, which has been shut down and for almost 2 years, and obviously will also need to have a large energy bill, and this will be again compounded by the surge in energy prices. And on the additional factor that we looked at is whether this increase in commodity prices is going to be a boost in terms of growth, and again, so that's on the y-axis, and the change in growth is not very spectacular, so it's difficult to give a straight answer here. And obviously there's so many, well, it's multifactorial, so we cannot just say it's related to what's happening in the commodity prices area, but we see that to combine some benefits in terms of balance of payment and in terms of growth, there's only a handful of countries that benefit from that, and we have again the happy few such as Kuwait, Saudi, and Oman. And this is related to some papers in the literature, especially recently by the World Bank, that shows that, again, gains in terms of trade and balance of payment are not necessarily translated into gains in terms of growth, especially in the long run. Now, the second key message, and Thomas talked about it in the introduction, is that the surge in commodity prices leads to an alarming surge in inflation. Inflation was forecast by the IMF in the World Economic Outlook in October 2021 at 3.8% for the world, and it was revised up to 7.4% in April. And I think in the upcoming revision in October this year, we're going to be closer to 8.5 or 9%. And this is something that is across the board, that is affecting every country, with some specificities that are mostly country specific. So it's difficult here to make some categorization. But one striking point is that inflation is usually higher for emerging and developing countries than advanced economies. And the main answer, the main reason for that is that energy and food account for a bigger share of the consumption basket than advanced economies. In EDCs, this share is about 52%, whereas it's only 38% in advanced economies. And if you look at the detail of some countries, food, for instance, is over 40% of the basket in Nigeria, in Senegal, in Ethiopia, and Sri Lanka. So when you have the energy component, you get to 60 or 65% of the consumption basket that is tied to those two elements, so energy and food, that have increased significantly since mid-2020, and explain this surge in inflation. Now, to fight inflation, governments might be tempted to resort to fiscal tools, especially subsidies, and this is something that we need to look at carefully when we talk about public finance and public accounts, because we know that several countries are in some difficult debt situation with degraded primary balances, high debt to GDP ratio, increased debt sustainability risk that we are all aware of. So there's a bit of an issue here for countries and for governments to address this inflation, and they'll have to strike a balance between addressing the reduction in purchasing power for households and containing socio-political tensions and socio-economic tensions that might arise from the loss of purchasing power, but also what they can do at the fiscal space. They have to address that. Having said that, there will be only a few winners from the surging in commodity prices, and again, the clear winners will be the hydrocarbon exporters with huge gains in their primary balances. And the last impact that we wanted to stress is has to do with food insecurity. So food insecurity strikes back, or is put to the fore again with this with the war in Ukraine. We've talked about shortage risks and the fact that we might see maybe shortages for, especially in the Middle East and Northern Africa, for countries that are heavily reliant on wheat or on a number of grains, cereals that are imported from Russia and Ukraine. So for Egypt, Tunisia, for instance, cereal imports account for over 50%. Cereal imports from Russia and Ukraine account for over 50% of total imports. So that's quite striking, and that's where the war in Ukraine is having a major impact, and it's quite concerning. But if we look at the details, well, first we know that countries have sufficient stocks to last until the end of the year, so it's maybe not that big of an issue in terms of quantities. The issue obviously is whether those countries will be ready to swallow the additional bill, and that's an issue at least until the end of 2022. We might be more concerned for 2023 if harvests are bad, because we know that there's been capacity reduction because of the war in Ukraine. There's been an increase in the price of fertilizers that is also reducing the possibility for farmers to farm and to harvest. So this is something that we'll maybe see a bit more down the road, starting in 2023. But for 2022, there's been a lot of talks about the fear of the rise in food shortages. I think it's more about prices. But what is important to stress here is that food insecurity is not something that has just happened in 2022. And in fact, the Food and Agriculture Organization was already saying in 2021 that the number of people facing an acute food crisis nearly doubled between 2016 and 2021. So the food crisis is not something just related to the war in Ukraine. It was something happening much before that. And this is related to local security issues, to climate change, to local economic shocks, and also to global economic shocks. So that's the last impact that we are investigating in this paper. To sum it up, in the next slide, we try to give a sort of heat map of the key impacts, and obviously, so in the second column of each chart, so we've divided this into Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Asia including several Caucasian countries, but you can see that the yellow squares are the ones with mostly negative impacts, and inflation is pretty negative everywhere. But in Latin America, we can see that most countries will, with green squares, will benefit in terms of primary balance and fiscal balance, whereas Asia, and especially some of the Caucasian countries, but also Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, will suffer from the increase in the commodity bill, I would say. So mostly a balance of payment issue. And again, we talked about the inflation issue. And the last point that we investigate in this paper is the impact of the commodity shock in terms of energy transition. So if we're here we have a sort of a chicken and egg situation, because we might think at first that the current situation is a great window of opportunity for low carbon transition. First, the winners from the current environments should probably reinvest the windfalls into renewable energy programs, whereas the losers, obviously it is an additional difficulty, but they realize they need to reduce their external reliance and energy bill, and will probably be incentivized to transition to a low carbon economy. But if we're looking at in more details, and Emmanuel mentioned it, the low carbon transition has already started, and the low carbon transition itself is driving demand for a number of commodities, especially the transition metals. So we talked about lithium, cobalt, nickel, and copper. Copper, which in recent years has been a bit the metal giving the outlook and the basic pulse of the global economy, and we know that metal prices have been increasing for quite a while now, and so with the supply and demand shocks that we talked about, those metals are particularly affected. Only a handful countries, a handful of EDCs will benefit from this. We can think about Democratic Republic of Congo, which owns 70% of global cobalt resources. We can think of Peru, that we're going to talk about later, and Chile, which collectively own over 40% of the market share of copper. Chile also owns over 20% of global resources for lithium, whereas Indonesia and the Philippines own over 45% of the markets of nickel. So only a handful of countries will benefit, but overall, what we know is that demand for those energy, for those transition metals has been on the rise for quite a while, and this demand obviously is having an impact on prices, which in turn might be delaying the transition, and that's where the chicken and egg situation comes, because we've seen the price in renewables increasing for the first time in over a decade, which again makes it more difficult for countries, even with ambitious programs, to invest in renewables, and adds to the pressure on their population and on pressure for increased subsidies. And those increased subsidies to fight inflation, again, might increase demand, this time demand for fossil fuel, because you will have consumers continuing to rely on fossil fuels that will again drive up demand for, drive up prices of those commodities. So that's where we're a bit in a conundrum. It doesn't mean that the energy transition needs to be put on the side. Actually, it's quite the contrary. We all know that we've seen extreme weather events in the last few months again, but it shows that it is maybe even more difficult in this current environment to accelerate the energy transition, which actually might be delayed because of the current environment, and something that needs to be looked at carefully. So I will leave it here, and we can maybe have a short Q&A session.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to have a Q&A. We already have a few questions in the chat, and I actually wanted to start things off with a question, and I can see in the chat that there is one question that is kind of related to the question I wanted to ask you, which was more like, given the fact that you talk about various prices of commodities, and some are going in one direction, some in another, and one of our colleagues in the chat was asking about the trends in the coming months of this commodity, depending on the commodity, seeing that Ukrainian cereal exports have finally resumed, and because of the recession warning, we also see that we can also see that energy prices are kind of starting to decline maybe recently in some areas. And so given this context and everything you've presented, would you see, or should we expect a new commodity cycle, super commodity cycle, a bit like we saw in 2000?
Well, yeah, it's quite interesting because we just disclaimer for everyone, we wrote this paper using data up until the end of May, and now right after that, and starting in June, you had a decline in some of the prices. Especially, so I would say energy overall has been broadly stable, some decline in the whole prices, but overall stable. But wheat has been down 20%, and metals have been down 30% for cobalt. Copper has been down 16%, nickel 14%. So it is true that looking at this, we could say, well, actually, it's not a super cycle, and things are changing pretty quickly. But we need to distinguish between the short term and the mid to long run. And in the short term, yes, we are talking about a decline in demand from China, especially China has been driving this commodity super cycle in 2000, and it's probably not the case anymore. China has been locked down for quite a while with zero COVID policy. They've announced some closures in some factories, so again, it's going to reduce demand, and we are talking about recession risks in advanced economies in the EU and in the US for 2023. That will reduce demand, and is probably one of the reasons why prices, especially for the transition metals, has been going down. But looking over the long run, it seems that the supply bottlenecks will last, and they're not done yet. We still have major tensions in Russia and Ukraine, and other geopolitical tensions might add to supply chain disruptions. So that's where it's quite difficult, obviously, to forecast. It probably looks like for the energy metals, this trend is not going to last, and this declining trend in the last few months will probably reverse again, and we'll see increases. The IMF was forecasting in a paper that the consumption of lithium to reach our climate goals by 2040 has to increase by a factor of 40 times. And for cobalt and nickel by a factor of 20 times. So I think there's no doubt that the energy transition is going to continue driving up metal prices. For food, it's a relief that yes, that port access has been opened, and that we're going to see more supply and probably an easing on the prices of food, and oil again has been quite stable in recent months, and obviously it's anyone's guess to see where things are going to go, but we see that even OPEC has not been really increasing supply for a different reason, but one of them is because they cannot necessarily increase it by much. So it looks like in the short term there are anticipations related to this recession of 2023 that mean that we're going to see a decline in prices, or at least some correction compared to what we've seen since maybe the beginning of the year. But the trend that we described that started in mid-2020 might continue when we're looking at things 5 to 7 years down the line.
Thank you. We also have a few questions as well in the chat related to inflation. So I'm going to try to group them in one question, because one of them was actually what about the solution of inflation in the world? And I think that this big question would deserve like a MacroDev by itself. So I would probably try to say that. And you mentioned some of them. You mentioned like the countries using fiscal tools to try to help limit the impact of inflation on like at least households and vulnerable people. But what could be some of the solutions that the country could put in place? And related to that, there is also a question related to the way of managing the impact of this shock on balance of payment. So maybe like, oh, inflation, like all these measures of this impact of inflation, how can the country limit the impact on their domestic economy, and what could they put in place, even if inflation is a country-specific issue, as you mentioned, what can they try to implement to limit the impact?
Well, I think that unless we found new tools, we know the classic tools to fight inflation. And obviously, so countries have resorted to fiscal policy again to give some relief to households by increasing subsidies. But we know that the other tool is monetary policy, and it's an increase in interest rates to reduce demand, which means to reduce consumption and investment. So households borrowing to buy a car, to buy new equipment, or companies investing in new factories are going to slow down because of increases in prices, increasing interest rates. So we know that these are the tools, and obviously the key, and we're seeing this issue mostly right now in advanced economies, especially in the US, to make sure that anticipations are not inflation expectations are not de-anchored. People still think that inflation is going to be just a temporary element and do not necessarily ask for increased wages that starts creating a feedback loop between wages and inflation, where people have higher wages, pay more, therefore drive demand, which increases prices, and in turn feeds inflation. So I think that the tools are known, and obviously it's a difficult balancing act for central banks to increase the interest rates without driving their economies too much into recession, which would add to the financial sufferings of the population and might increase discontents, riots, strikes, etc. We've seen this in countries that have been mismanaged. We've seen eruptions of violence, especially recently in Sri Lanka, for instance. But that was related to other domestic issues. But it is a balancing act again, and subsidies are again helping in the short run, but might be an issue because they fuel they keep demand for energy prices at a high level, and which means that they keep the level of inflation quite high. So there's no magic solution, but it has to be a mix between fiscal and monetary policy.
Thank you. And I think it actually answers some of the questions we received as well in the chat regarding the impact of US interest rate rising and how it could impact emerging and developing countries. I don't know if you want to add anything more on that, on the way it could impact that, or otherwise we can.
Well, the thing is, again, the increase in interest rates in the US might lead to recession in the US, which will reduce demand in the US, but given the size of the US economy, probably global demand as well. So it might also keep prices at more reasonable levels. But at the same time, for emerging and developing markets, it means that you have this increase in interest rates, which is attracting a lot more capital, and is increasing the value of the US dollar against all those emerging currencies. And we've seen that the depreciation of several emerging currencies started not only since January 2022, but even last year, and had an impact on countries such as Brazil, Colombia, with the value of their local currency depreciating, meaning that they have a higher import bill, and this is driving up imported inflation as well. So we can see that the impact of the U.S. monetary policy is not neutral to our emerging and developing countries. But in terms of the impacts on commodities, we'll see. We'll see if it really is sufficient in terms of demand to offset the supply issues that we talked about.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take maybe one more question before going to our second session. That's a question that you may not be able to answer, but if you can, that would be a perfect transition to the country cases as well. Regarding the increase, if you have noticed any increase in renewable energies investment in Africa, but I would extend the question to in emerging and developing countries in general. And if you've noticed any increase in this type of investment, and again, caveat that you mentioned that we got that in May, so and this type of investment takes time as well to be put in place. But would it be driven mostly by companies or like by hydrocarbon companies? That was the specific question, or new challenger, or like do you see like more investment and do you see like more people coming in the game?
So I'm not an expert, and it's something that would have been actually very interesting to discuss with our external guest. But I think it's we've seen first in terms of the transition metals, there was an underinvestment for over a decade until the mid 2010s, and that's one of the reasons also prices have been going up, because there's really this imbalance between capacity and demand for those metals. But we've seen in recent years a pickup in investment for this area. And in terms of pure renewables, it's you have pure players that are specialized in purely renewables, and again they've been in the market for. The market has been growing for 10, 15 years, and prices, cost of renewable energy has been going down for over 10 years, and it's only now that we've seen this reversal. But I would say it's probably too soon to tell, to see whether those specialized companies are picking up investment just because of the current commodity price environment.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you for this insightful information. We're gonna go directly to our second session. So we're gonna have 3 AFP economists, senior economists around the table presenting the country cases today. So we're gonna start maybe with Maylan Le Goff, who will talk about Mozambique. Then Alex Vigato will talk about Peru, and then Sylvain Bellefontaine will talk about Nigeria. Just before we start, a reminder to use the question tab if you can. We are trying to look into the chat, but it's sometimes a bit hard to go in between the two tabs. So feel free to ask all your questions in the Q&A, because we're going to have a Q&A session after at the end of the 3 country cases. So maybe Maylan, if you want to start?
Yes, thank you, Madam.
Just waiting for the slides. Here we go.
So, regarding the commodity issue, the Mozambican case is of particular interest. Indeed, we can almost speak about a new resource-rich country. Of course, the richness of the Mozambican subsoil has been known for a very long time. It's not new, but the discoveries of huge natural gas reserves along, of the coast of Cabo Delgado have really changed the game, and prompted the Mozambican state to bet even more on its extractive sector. And given the international context, this could appear as a good choice, but at the same time, there are still many risks that could mitigate returns on investment. And even if expectations are met, their ability to deeply modify the current economic model of Mozambique is very uncertain. So first of all, let's come back to the main characteristics of the Mozambican economic model. So between, as you can see on the graph, between 1990 and 2015, the economic growth has been very dynamic, driven first by the reconstruction after the Civil War, and then by big investments in mega projects, first in aluminium, then in coal, and more recently in the gas sector. And at the same time, the share of the mining sector in exports has significantly increased, while the agriculture has remained one of the main sectors of the Mozambican economy. That's why the economic growth of Mozambique is very vulnerable to climatic shock, and it is also increasingly exposed to international price variations. So you can see an important slowdown of the economic growth after 2015, and it can be attributed to different shocks, both internal and external. First, the decline of commodity prices since 2014, the discovery of hidden debts in 2016, followed by a fall in FDI and of donor support. The insurrection in the north that started in 2017, the two violent cyclones in 2019, and on the top of that, the COVID-19 crisis that led to a recession in 2020. Note also that there are many structural factors hindering economic diversification, like the weakness of governance, of human capital, and of infrastructures. And as expected, this economic model has left a large part of the economy behind, and it has failed to significantly reduce poverty, which remains very high, as well as social inequalities and disparities between southern and northern regions. And moreover, the country has one of the worst HDI in the world. So if gas projects currently in the pipeline materialize, benefits in terms of fiscal and export revenues could support the implementation of policies to diversify the economy with potentially some effects on poverty reduction. So on the next slide, we can see that in this objective, Mozambique has massively invested in this sector to the point of finding itself in what some researchers call a fiscal pre-surplus. Indeed, its structural budget deficit has even more deteriorated after gas discoveries because of an increase in capital expenditures needed to develop infrastructures linked to projects. And because its tight fiscal room of maneuver, the Mozambican state had no choice but to go into debt via loans backed by future gas revenues. That's why the debt ratio has significantly increased after gas discoveries, as you can see on the graph on the left, and also after, of course, the revelation of the hidden debt in 2016, when the debt ratio reached almost 120% of GDP. Regarding the current account on the right side, things are quite similar, with an amplification of the current account deficit following gas discoveries due to imports required to construct infrastructures needed to implement gas projects. A very illustrative example is the recent imports of the floating LNG platform for $4 billion for the project led by the Eni's company. And this will for sure contribute to a significant deterioration of the current account deficit in 2022, which is expected to reach 45% of GDP. So next slide. The Mozambican strategy to massively invest in the gas sector could pay off in this period of high gas prices and at a time when European countries try to free themselves from the Russian gas. And it is no coincidence that the EU recently announced an increase in its military aid for Mozambique. Moreover, the implementation of some reforms regarding governance has contributed to the return of multilateral donors. For example, Mozambique signed an ECF program with the IMF last spring, and it's got a $300 million grant from the World Bank last June. The project to create a sovereign wealth fund constitutes a big reassuring point regarding the management and the use of future gas revenues. And finally, while the start of LNG production has been regularly postponed, the production of the offshore in this platform is expected to start by the end of the year. However, one of the biggest remaining risks is, of course, the still ongoing conflict in the Cabo Delgado. New attacks were perpetrated again last September in the Nampula province, so just south of the Cabo Delgado, as you can see on the map, raising fears of a spread of the conflict. And as you probably know, 2 big gas projects have been interrupted because of the security situation, and they don't have resumed so far. Another concern is the weakness of institutions, because as you know for sure, there is a big literature evidencing that the risk of experiencing what we call a resource curse for countries is more important when institutions are fragile. And finally, coming revenues from big gas projects will be limited in the first years of operation, and a large share of these revenues will be used to repay debt. So, in other words, I would say that Mozambique has a big card to play in the current international context, but it should remain vigilant to not see its current fiscal resource curse turns into a more traditional resource curse.
Thank you very much, Megan. Maybe we can go directly to Peru.
Yes, thank you, Emmanuel. We got to another continent with Peru, as in this country, the development model is largely based on the exploitation of mineral resources, as we have many different mineral resources in Peru, including copper, gold, or silver. As you can see on the next slide, yes, on the first graph, you can see that extractive industries in red have been the main contributor to growth over the last years, at least the 5 years before COVID. And we can consider that it accounted for 14% of GDP, so it's quite huge. And it's estimated that mining concessions are covering about 15% of the country. So it's quite huge, and it's followed by different services, including telecommunication, trade, or transport. And you can see that agriculture, including fishery, remain quite strong over the period. If you look at the second graph, you can see that the Peruvian economy has been very dynamic over the past 20 years. We had an annual growth rate of over 5% in average between 2002 and 2019. So it's quite huge. And it means that Peru has been one of the most dynamic economies in Latin America over this period. You can see that the main driver of this growth has been the extractive industries, which have benefited from what is called, and Maxime explained earlier, the commodity super cycle. So you had productive investment and a brilliant international demand. But after 2014, there has been a slowdown in the GDP growth rate due to the end of this super cycle. You can see this on the second graph. The annual growth rate has decreased something like 3% of GDP, while it was close to 6% before that. So of course, in 2020, the economy suffered very badly from the pandemic. You can see that the country faced a severe recession, but we had a rebound in 2021 after the pandemic, and this rebound was more dynamic than anticipated, with a GDP growth rate over 13%, so it's quite huge one more time. And if we look at the main reasons of this dynamic rebound, of course, there is a significant base effect and the maintaining of fiscal support measures, but we also have a recovery which was supported by the sharp rise in commodity prices, including the copper prices that reached an all-time high in 2021. On the next slide, if we look at fiscal and external accounts, you can see that the end of the commodity super cycle and the slowdown in growth that I mentioned naturally led to imbalances. So first, with finances on the first graph, you can see that the fall in commodity prices led to a deficit in the fiscal balance. So the line, which is the budget balance, was in green territory. So you had a surplus until 2014, and after that you have a deficit. And as a consequence, public debt in blue rose by 6 points of GDP in 5 years, and it rose by eight more points in 2020 due to the pandemic. But in 2021, this debt ratio stabilized at something like 35%, and the IMF forecast that the fiscal deficit will gradually move closer to balance. So this is a good point, and we have to mention that despite the imbalances that I mentioned, public debt remains very low in Peru in comparison to international standards. For many reasons, the authorities have managed to maintain public debt at a relatively low level. If we look at the second graph about external accounts, it's broadly the same situation. So we have a current account balance strongly depending on fluctuation in the extractive sectors through many canals. We have, of course, the exports in volume, the global prices, and flows of profit remittances by multinational companies operating in the sector in Peru. And as you can see on the graph, there is a strong correlation between exports in volume and commodity prices. We have here the Brent price used as a proxy. It's logical as commodities represent the bulk of Peruvian exports. And as for fiscal accounts, and despite some tensions since 2014 and the end of the commodity super cycle, we have to mention that the external position of Peru remains quite strong for many reasons. The first one is the fact that the country has very comfortable exchange reserves, which are covering something like 12 months of imports of goods and services in Peru. The country also has privileged access to international financial markets. It's rated, the sovereign debt is rated as investment grade by the main rating agencies. And Peru also has a precautionary credit line from the IMF of about $5 billion. So yeah, the external position of Peru remains quite strong for all of these reasons. So you can understand that the rise in commodity prices this last 2 years has a positive impact on growth and a positive impact on fiscal and external balances. However, it also has some negative impacts on the social political situation. Next slide, please. In terms of context in Peru, you had 4 presidents who led the country between 2000 and 2018. They are all involved in a vast corruption scandal. And there were 5 successive presidents between 2018 and 2021. So we have a lot of political instability in Peru. And the new president, called Pedro Castillo, has been elected in July 2021. The tensions remain very high, and as you can see on the graph on the right, approval ratings for the president as well as for the Congress are decreasing. And although very low, it's close and below 20%. It's because, yeah, you have all this instability. For instance, there were 4 different prime ministers since July 2021, and there were 2 impeachment procedures that have been launched against him. So, yeah, a lot of instability in Peru. And this instability has been exacerbated by the conflict in Ukraine, because Peru is not very, at least directly exposed to the conflict in Ukraine, apart from some imports of Russian fertilizers. But the economy suffers from the increase in prices indirectly resulting from the war. And as you can see on the second graph, inflation has been accelerating for several months, and you can see that it's now over 8% year on year, so it's quite a lot. And despite the fact that the authorities try to tackle this rising inflation, it's still growing. You had some measures that have been implementing. You have emergency measures on the fiscal front, including fuel tax, cut in the fuel tax, and cut in VAT, as well as a revaluation of the minimum wage. And on the central bank has also sharply tightened its monetary policy. You can see on the second graph, it's the red line. We had 13 increases in the key interest rate. These are 13 months. But despite these different measures, the increase in food price is still rising. It fuels the discontent of the nation. And it seems that the position of the President Castillo, has been very much weakened due to this inflation. So you can understand why the rise in commodity prices do not only have positive effects, it's definitely a double-edged sword for Peru. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Maybe we can now continue with Sylvain for Nigeria.
Yes, thank you. Well, as you may know, Nigeria, the Nigerian economy is very dependent on oil. I would say it's an oil addict economy. So the consequences is that the dependence on oil means that the macroeconomic situation has been very volatile over the past decade, notably since the oil shock in 2014. So you know that 18%, 19% of export are coming from oil, of which 15% is gas. That's very important in terms of opportunity in the coming years to develop this production of gas regarding the energy crisis in Europe. So it's just in a nutshell an introduction to say that there is many constraints for the economy of Nigeria, but there is also opportunity in the medium and long term, and even in the short term if the country doesn't miss the train to Europe. So on this first chart on the left, you can see the GDP growth trend over the past decade, and especially the negative contribution of the oil sector in red. So at the same time, the manufacturing sectors also perform very bad and is underdeveloped in the country. Finally, the growth trend has been supported by the service sectors and agriculture. It's also the case for the creation of jobs, and also the informality, strong informality and informal economy play an important role in terms of socioeconomic buffers. It explains why the population has been rather resilient over the past period, and especially during the COVID-19 crisis. So you can see on the right-hand chart the external position of the country, the trajectory over the past 20 years. And you saw that the current account surplus has vanished, and now we're in a deficit position, which has been amplified during the past 2 years. And it's related to the decline in oil prices, but it's very important in terms of FX devaluation and FX policies that the country implemented over the past 6 years. Since 2015, the central bank has operated a growing peg or managed float, but there is a strong devaluation and depreciation of the currency. FX reserves have been very volatile, and even though they increased a bit in recent months, thanks to oil prices, it's not very correlated with the oil price evolution. So FX reserves remain rather flat despite oil prices on the rise. And the main issue you can see on the next slide, is related to the decline, I would say, the depleting oil production. You can see in yellow the trend. Oil production, oil output has been halved over the past 2 years, and it is now below 1 million barrels per day. Now Nigeria is only the 4th oil exporter in Africa, behind Algeria, Libya, and Angola. It's a new situation. The quota, the OPEC quota, is 1.8 million barrels per day, and the production is only 1 million. So you are the surge in oil prices on one side, on the other side, the oil output is declining very fast. It's due to theft, mainly, problem of maintenance, and investment in the sector. So the positive point is that you can see in blue, the blue line, natural gas production, which is increasing rather fast, even though it is more or less stable since 2021. But it's very important. We will say in a few minutes that it's a very important opportunity for the country. So on the one side, you have the decline in oil output, and on the other side, you can see on the chart on the right that there is no longer correlation between oil-related revenues and oil price. You can see that oil-related revenue have been declining over the past 2 years, even though oil price is on the rise. So it's due to the fact that the government is subsidizing fuel prices very strongly. It's a huge impact on the public finances. It's the reason why the IMF does not expect any fiscal consolidation in the near term, but also in the medium term, with revenue cap at around 7 to 8% of GDP only, which is one of the most the lowest level in the world. So it's a very important issue for the country to increase revenue, and it will come thanks to a rebound in the energy sectors, but also a comprehensive fiscal reform. But the country is on the verge of experiencing a new election. Elections are coming soon, next year in February, so the government doesn't want to increase oil prices, to increase fuel prices, and to increase taxation. On the next slide, the final one, you can see the inadequate policy and foreign exchange policies that are very detrimental for the economy and very ineffective. The country has experienced double-digit inflation over the past decade, and now we have inflation above 20% in August, driven by food prices, which are above 20%, and it's very detrimental for the population. It has a very strong ramification in terms of socio-political risk and impoverishment of the population. So this problem is structural. The problem is that the strategy, the FX strategy of the government implemented since 2015 is a mess for the economy because of import barriers, FX control, and the willingness to preserve FX reserve and to develop industrial economy. At the end of the day, there is stock shortage, inflationary pressure, and even recessionary pressure in the country. So in the coming years, the country has to reform all the system and to improve the business environment, to attract investors, and to enable the export sectors and the manufacturing sectors to develop. And the final point and issue I would like to highlight is the demographic trend. The World Bank signaled that demographics is a time bomb for the country. The United Nations expect the Nigerian population to be the third in the world before 2015, and it's a very important point because of the low living standard in the country and the declining GDP per capita over the past few years. So social-political and socio-economic risks are very important in the country. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sylvain. Thank you to the three of you, actually, for this very useful information. Again, for people online, feel free to ask your question in French or in English using the tab question. I'm going to start with the first question, actually. Maybe we can go in the same order as the order we had, so Mylan, Alex, and Sylvain. I actually wanted to ask you a question about the low carbon transition, and more specifically, well, you kind of talk about it a little bit in your presentation, but I was wondering what could be the current opportunities and challenges associated to the low carbon transition in each of the countries you presented.
Regarding Mozambique, I would say that the Mozambican economy is not that much at risk regarding the low carbon transition. Its exposition is mainly linked to its exports of coal. But of course, if gas projects materialize, its dependency on the gas sector will increase. But the natural gas is less emissive than coal, for example, and it is presented by Mozambican leaders, among others, as a possible solution for the energy transition in Africa and also for Africans' access to electricity. But at the same time, natural gas is a fossil energy, and during the last COP26, high-income countries committed to no longer finance fossil fuel projects, even if given the current crisis, things are changing a little. So I would say that in the coming years, Mozambique doesn't have to worry about its exports of gas, but in the longer term, it will be crucial to invest in human capital and to do some efforts to diversify the economy to turn into a greener economy.
Well, for Peru, I would say that the transition is more a source of opportunity than challenges for the country because, well, for at least two reasons. First one is the fact that the energy mix is mostly relying on hydropower, so it's a key element to reach net zero by 2050, which is the objective of the government. And the second argument I would say is as you understood, the export base of Peru is mostly made up of minerals that will be necessary to transition, including copper, of course. So yeah, definitely it's more a source of opportunity for Peru, despite some investments and efforts that have to be made. But yeah, be more a source of opportunity.
For Nigeria?
For Nigeria, I would say that the country is definitely vulnerable and exposed to low carbon transition, but in the medium to long term. And in the short term, it is an opportunity. The major opportunity is for the country to take advantage of the situation in Europe and to export gas. But there is a very huge gas infrastructure gap in the country, and it will need $2 billion investment per year for the next 10 years. And the country does not have the capacity to finance. A few weeks or months ago, the European Union has committed to provide $400 million for this. So there is really a good fit between the EU and Nigeria. But I worry. I'm a bit worried about the fact that the country could miss the train, as I mentioned previously, and to be too late for Nigeria to benefit from the situation in Europe. And in the medium term, definitely the country has to adapt to the situation, low carbon transition. But it's not as many developing countries, not an emitting country. The effort has to be done from in developed country, and emerging countries are not market makers, are market taker in the low carbon transition coming soon or coming in the medium term, depending on the choice made by emitting countries. And yes, it's a very interesting and important issue, but overall, I would say that emerging countries are taker of the decision made in other countries.
Yeah, I think absolutely that's indeed a fact. I have another question that is kind of related to a question in the chat regarding the fact that the countries you presented were kind of well, they are all commodity exporters and linked to commodity in a way or another. So wouldn't they be stuck as commodity exporters given the situation and given eventually the need of for inflow of dollars, or like as you said, for Nigeria, the need of having this kind of commodity exporting in order to like boost revenues? And are they diversifying? Like if I extend the question, are they diversifying and how can they diversify? So are you seeing I don't know, reforms or things that the countries are doing in order to diversify or not? Maybe the answer is they are not diversifying. So what would you say? Maybe you can begin with you.
Regarding Nigeria or
In Nigeria, yeah,
Nigeria,
related to that.
diversification is definitely an issue, and even though the oil sectors represent only 7% of GDP, the manufacturing sector is very underdeveloped, and it's due to the very difficult operational environment due to regulation, the fact that local businesses do not have access to to import easily due to exchange control, barriers to import. So it's very detrimental for developing a local economy and a competitive export sectors regarding other countries in Africa and the world. So it's part of the government strategy to diversify, but the context is not very easy for this.
For the others, will be Felix.
I would say that in Peru, the economy is more diversified than in Nigeria or Mozambique. So you have, of course, mining, but you also have agriculture, fishery, or tourism. So it's less question in Peru. The question was mentioning the impact on the exchange rate in Peru. But, well, if you look at on the last 2 years, the exchange rate has been more impacted by political tensions than the price of the commodity prices. So I would say that it's less question in Peru than in Nigeria or Mozambique.
Thank you.
In the case of Mozambique, as I told, there is a big agricultural sector too, but it's very it's almost informal and subsistence agricultural sector. So there is a very interesting report published recently by the World Bank explaining how the agriculture could play a role in Mozambique to have a more inclusive growth and also maybe to diversify the economy. Another point is to try to support the private sector, and in that sense, the initiative of the government through the program of economic acceleration announced last August is interesting because they propose to do some reforms to facilitate business environments. So it could be a good thing to facilitate business and diversify the economy, as well as access to credit. Also could be a good point to increase the private sector outside the extractive sector and to diversify the economy.
But if I may, I think this issue is really tied to the resource curse, and it is, again, you talked about it. It's a matter of institutions and whether you put in place the right governance. And we've seen, obviously, in history the back in the mid 20th century, Norway is an example of good governance and how to use your resources wisely, because initially they had resource curse impacts. And Peru has previous macro policies, and countries, for instance, in Mozambique, puts in place this sovereign wealth fund to finance diversification. That's one of the solutions, the way to go, rather than countries that have just been spending when you have windfalls and when everything is good, and then once the shock is happening, like in 2014, you started recording a huge external and public deficit. So the answer usually to that is mostly institutional capacity. So that's where maybe countries will not be that much prisoners of their exports.
Well, thanks for adding that as well, Maxime. I may have like one last question before finishing the Q&A. It's a more general question. It would be more about, and you already started to like highlight some points, but it would be more about what like could be the different tools that, or like levers that the country, each of your countries could put in place to have a stronger recovery, to either have a recovery because like there was a recession because of COVID and because of this cycle, or to have a stronger recovery in the case of Peru, where the recovery already started. What can they put in place given this context of like post-COVID-19 and now another period of instability? I know it's a vast question that could actually be a macro dev by itself as well, but if you could maybe share like two points each. Maybe I don't know who wants to begin. Alex?
Yeah, the main problem is in Peru is as I mentioned, the political instability. The economy is okay, I would say, but the problem is that any reform is possible at that time because there is this instability, there is the opposition between the president and Congress. So if you want to change the economy, and of course there are some reforms that are necessary in Peru, including the fact that most of the economy is informal or things like this. The problem is that at the moment, political instability and opposition between the Congress and the president are blocking any major reforms. So I would say that it's going to be very complicated. And the IMF mentioned that the potential growth for Peru has been decreasing. It's now only 3%. So the main problem for Peru is to end the main stake for Peru is to end this political instability to be able to vote some key reforms that are necessary for this country.
For Mozambique, actually, the economic growth will be mainly relying on the export on the gas project developed by the Italian company Economies, which is expected to start by the end of the year. And if it's the case, the economic growth is expected to grow by 3.8% in 2022. But the longer term, but I already spoke about this, but it will be important to try to diversify the economy, and but the government seems to be implementing some reforms to put this in place. Yeah.
From Nigeria?
For Nigeria, the government, the national development plan of the government is to achieve 5% growth in the coming years, which is far above the growth potential of the country, which is estimated by the IMF at around 3%, which is below the average for the continent, which is 4%. And the goal of the government is to counter private investment and PPP, very private investment project. The amount is $850 billion, which is unrealistic. And but some targets maybe can be reached regarding the development of the agricultural sectors to be self-sufficient in agriculture and livestock, and to be able to export, to improve capacity to have its own fertilizer production, and to be less dependent on Russia in terms of fertilizer, for instance, and so on. There is a huge project in the pipe, but at the end of the day, the financing is not there. So I'm a bit disappointed. But I think that to finish with the positive word, the population is resilient in this country, and I hope that the situation could be better. But we're in a transition period because the elections are coming, so let's wait and see next year what could be decided by the government.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm just going to try to wrap up and summarize a bit what we learned today, and feel free to complement after that if I forgot something. But basically, I would say that what we can take away is that the current shock is surprising, it's strong, and it kind of reminds us of previous energy and food crises. But at the same time, it's not something that we've never seen before, it's not something new. There are a few factors that are kind of behind this current boom, which is the COVID-19, the climate change, and the war in Ukraine, which is kind of like the three main things that are kind of exacerbating this current boom. And then these macroeconomic consequences of this cycle and this period are quite different from a country to another. So it's different among countries. So there are winners and losers. Maxime talked about that. We saw that as well with the country cases. So we have winners and losers in terms of balance of payment, also in terms of fiscal impact. The shock also has translated into inflation all across the board. It's something that we've seen in the past, but we hadn't seen that for a few years. So it's kind of a new thing that we rediscover in a way. And the transition from to a low carbon economy that we've been talking about multiple times might suffer from the shock. But again, there is also a window of opportunity. Some countries can kind of surf the wave of this global situation to try to reduce their reliance on fossil fuel and kind of accelerate the transition. That's already what Peru is doing, but other countries are as well. But there is only a few winners, basically. We said that there are winners and losers, but there are actually only a few winners that will benefit from the current environment. Maxime highlighted some of them. And more than ever, development finance institutions and like the global institution are needed to support the affected countries and in trying to mobilize a fund to reach their climate goals. So it's really something that is needed right now. I don't know if you want to add something, Maxime, maybe in terms of conclusion, is there anything that I'm missing or that?
No, I think that was a very good summary.
Okay.
Thank you to everyone online.
And I also wanted to to thank all of you to being with us today, but also tell you that the publication is now available online, so you can go see it. There are other countries that haven't been talked about today that are in the publication. The publication is available on the website, but also on Facebook, on LinkedIn, and on the website you can also find other publication. There are two that are going to come out soon, one on Uzbekistan and one on Democratic Republic of Congo, so feel free to check them out. You can subscribe to our newsletter, this way you're going to know as well when the publications are out. The next publication of this MacroDev will likely be in February next year, so there won't be a webinar for this one, but there will be another webinar next September, so we'll see each other again next year. And feel free to reach out to us at any time through website directly, through LinkedIn, Facebook, and social media. We are reachable at any time. And again, thanks for being with us. I realize I never introduced myself, so I'm Emmanuel Mansart, also part of the team, and I was really